The Psychedelic Report.
Psychedelic drugs
have played their part in America's long, strange trip toward an understanding of mind-altering drugs.
The Psychedelic News.
Leading physicians, scientists, and experts share their wisdom about psychedelic medicines and healing.
50 years ago, psychedelic drugs were at the center of America's counterculture.
The brightest minds in psychedelic medicine. The Psychedelic Report.
We use the ketamine-assisted psychotherapy model that happens to have psychedelic effects that were not predicted when the drug was first developed.
From researchers to investors.
I think the biggest mistake we've made as a culture is the war on drugs.
To physicians to shamans and nonprofit pioneers.
Psychedelic drugs.
Recent research suggests some of them could have legitimate uses.
The Psychedelic News
brings you diverse perspectives from the front lines of this exciting movement. The Psychedelic Report.
The Psychedelic Report was brought to you by Apollo Neuroscience and produced by Future Medicine Media. Welcome to the Psychedelic Report, your single source of truth for the psychedelic news. I'm your host, Dr. Dave Rabin. I'm a neuroscientist and psychiatrist trained in ketamine-assisted psychotherapy as well as MDMA-assisted therapy. Today on the Psychedelic Report, we're continuing to follow the controversy surrounding the MDMA-assisted therapy trials conducted by MAPS and Lykos, and the surprising vote from the FDA Advisory Committee around the lack of safety of this powerful and effective treatment according to prestigious scientific publications. At this time, if you've been following the news, it appears that a relatively radical anti-capitalist group has been behind the negative misinformation that has been pushed to the FDA Advisory Committee around why they should have second thoughts about the safety of MDMA-assisted therapy, despite the substantial scientific evidence that has been published and put forward by MAPS and Lykos. Again, this was extremely surprising to the scientific community and the community of veterans and patients at large suffering from PTSD, given what information had been available to the public prior to the FDA Advisory Committee's vote. To understand more about the vote and what was motivating it, we are joined today by Jesse Gould. Jesse is a former Army Ranger and a pioneer in psychedelic therapies for veterans. As founder and president of the Heroic Hearts Project, Jesse has spearheaded the research and acceptance of ayahuasca, ibogaine, ketamine, and psilocybin therapy programs for military veterans. Jesse has connected hundreds of veterans to psychedelic treatments, partnered with the world's leading psychedelic centers, and is researching psychiatric applications with the University of Georgia, the University of Texas, Austin Dell Medical School, and Imperial College of London. His mission is to help military veterans struggling with mental trauma and spread awareness of the benefits that psychedelic therapies offer as an alternative treatment to pharmaceuticals. Jesse has spoken globally about the benefits of psychedelics on mental health and has been featured in the New York Times, the New Yorker, The Economist, and Forbes, and is recognized as one of the most influential voices in psychedelics today. To date, Heroic Hearts Project has raised over $10 million and has served over 1,500 veterans and military spouses through psychedelic therapies. Jesse, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. It's a true pleasure to have you.
It's great to be here. It took us a while to finally match up schedules. I know we're both busy, but always appreciated your work and so honored to be here.
Likewise, and it's great to have you. And, the first thing that I want to chat with you about is, on June 4th, there was this recent and surprising vote from an FDA Advisory Committee that voted 10-1 and that the safety risks of MDMA-assisted therapy do not outweigh the benefits of this treatment, which seems, from a clinical and research background and somebody who's, researched these treatments, like many researchers, confusing because the data from the study seems to be quite robust and substantial. But I'm curious, could you comment a little bit on that and the impact that had as a veteran on the veterans community?
Absolutely. And this is, as you said, coming from I guess more layman's perspective. And For the past 7 years with Heroic Hearts, we've been connecting veterans to these treatments and really just asking, if not yelling, hey, we need something more effective to treat PTSD, to treat the suicide epidemic, just because there really hasn't been any real innovation, and more veterans have committed or taken their own lives by a factor of 20 than died in combat. So the estimated number is 150,000 veterans to date versus 7 to 8,000 in combat. And so it's just clear that despite government spending a lot of money, that just really hasn't been effective. So from my standpoint, from a lot of people within the veteran community who are aware of this, MDMA was a very exciting thing, because we all know it's not a cure-all, but we can at least bump up the numbers of people being helped by treatments. That's going to save lives inevitably. And that's goes beyond even just the veteran scope of how many millions have PTSD, tens of millions around the world. So it's just a thing that's desperately needed. And there's just been such a beautiful grassroots effort around MDMA. There's all the weirdness and issues, as with anything or as with any therapies. You see that the darkness as well as the lightness, but it is a pretty monumental effort. I don't know if there's ever been a case before where a substance has gone through FDA trials completely or almost completely grassroots funded, right? And it's just the FDA process is not made for that. It's made for substances that will make back the company money, because they cost hundreds of millions of dollars to go through, all this kind of stuff. And I think we're all following the same sort of news feed of, hey, this is having 67% success rate, 71% success rate on treatment-resistant depression, or treatment-resistant PTSD rather, as well as we're seeing pretty similar results across the board on psychedelics. So at this point, we have had positive news cycle, but a lot of us who are in this space, we have a lot of reason to believe that there is some basis behind it. It's not only the research has been backing up thousands upon thousands of anecdotal stories, which not scientific, but at a certain point you can't ignore those either. So again, I'm coming from a non-scientific standpoint. I'm pretty well versed, but I'm also not a PhD or that, so I can't lend my expertise to that. There's many others. And so it was pretty surprising when that advisory committee vote came down, and a lot of us were just like, what happened? And what is this advisory committee? Like, why does this have such a strong role to play in this? And why did this seem to be so counter? And it's been interesting since as well, because it's almost as with everything else in the world, it seems like people are living in very disparate worlds too, where I've seen some researchers look at it and be like, oh yeah, there's nothing there. Oddly enough, those people weren't speaking up before. But then there's other people that are like, yeah, there's absolutely there, and there's something wrong. So it's hard for the average person to be like, what's going on here? Because it seems like people are reading off two different cue cards. From my perspective, and I've done a lot of deep diving into this, from what I've seen, and the people I trust who know this do say that, yeah, MAPS going into Lycos, there was some sloppiness, there was some stuff they could have done better. There was a room for improvement, right? But that's all to be expected, because they're not a billion-dollar company like Pfizer, right? They don't have the money. But the science does speak for itself, and the science is supportive. And that's hands down what I've been seeing, that this does offer a potential huge benefit to those with PTSD and the baseline science. So then when you dig in deeper, what seemed to happen with the FDA advisory committee is that some of the people on the committee weren't necessarily trained clinicians. It's like a random dynamic. From other people's perspective, it seemed like this is what I kept hearing, that they came in with their minds made up, or they weren't necessarily well versed in psychedelic treatments in general, or they weren't well versed in PTSD landscape in general. We all get caught up in this. Yeah, there's evidence-based cures for PTSD. And if you look on that surface level, it's like, oh, great, we have some cures for PTSD. But if you actually look at the results, even if it's evidence-based, it's pretty abysmal what's out there. And so just this broader context seemed to be missing. And it really echoed the same thing that happened in the ICER report. And so you kind of get, from an outside standpoint, these two odd, weird events that seemed particularly bent against this MDMA treatment, which before had pretty positive results. And so that starts people asking, what's going on? What's the difference here from what I've been told, what I'm seeing versus what these people are seeing? And so going again deeper into what we saw from the advisory committee, there was weird things of like comparing it to cocaine addiction, or there was a bunch of veteran groups there that did have the ability to speak, but the conversation didn't go to their complaints or what they needed. That wasn't really brought up when people were contemplating like their vote, but instead it got brought up to other events that happened during the course of these trials. There was some cases of abuse that were dealt with in the proper ways, and there were victims, again, horrible, but there's a reason there's malpractice insurance, because, sometimes people take advantage of bad situations. But for some reason, instead of the science, it seemed to get focus on these other things, which at the end of the day, the FDA's decision is on, is this a beneficial treatment, not all these other kind of stuff, because that stuff can be resolved. That stuff, once it is approved, goes into the medical system where there is malpractice safeguards, there is more analysis, and there is more lights on it, as opposed to keeping it in the underground where oftentimes these abuses happen. Right. And so it's a question of like, why was this the main focus as opposed to the actual science? And then I guess turning it all the way back around to what you led off with is their assessment. There's two votes, one saying that the science did not show, in their opinion, that it was effective or there was not enough science. And then two, that from their, I think they did 9-2 on this one, that the potential benefits did not outweigh the risks. And again, I go back to this number of 150,000 veteran lives. And if that's not even brought up, how can you even entertain the idea that the potential benefits don't outweigh the risks, right? Like, that's a huge amount of life lost from a lack of treatments out there. And when I mentioned that, somebody was like, well, they did say that they understand that the PTSD crisis is there. I mean, I've come from the past 7-8 years of people saying, hey, I know there's a problem, but I'm not going to do anything about it. And this just seemed like another case of that, of like, oh yeah, I know that's there, but when you give me the opportunity to actually do something about it, I'm just not going to do that. And so I can't, again, I'm not an expert enough to know, is it a problem with the advisory committee? Is it just one of those weird one-off things that wires got crossed? Who knows? I mean, there just seem to be a lot of weird issues around it, including some of the things where some of the stuff they brought up, like the double blinding, they really seem to focus on that. And there was an instance where the Lycos maps had the agreement with the FDA. Like, the FDA was tracking a lot of this. The FDA declared the breakthrough. The FDA passed it through all these staged trials of clinical trials. So where's the difference between what was going on with conversations with the FDA and this advisory committee? It should be better connected, And that's me coming from the outside of like, the lineup doesn't seem to be there. And I don't know enough about that whole process to understand where the cracks are, but we just see certain commonality in issues, and we see certain commonality in the voices that are looking to derail this process as well.
Yeah, I think there's, a couple things I want to pull out, which are that, what you were saying, that MDMA-assisted therapy is, from the trials results, one of the best treatments we've ever had for disorders like PTSD that affect veterans in a disproportionate percentage of the population compared to the regular population. But there's tens of millions of people who have PTSD that could benefit from this treatment. And, I think what you're saying, and what Jonathan Lebecki also called out, I think Dan Crenshaw as well, is that it's the main message that's being sent is by the committee, which did only have one member of the FDA on the committee, from what I know, and also only one person who had any knowledge or expertise in the psychedelic field out of the 11 or 12 people on the committee. But what the message that I'm hearing from what they're saying, and is correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's safer to live with PTSD without adequate treatment, which is where we are today, than it is to get access to the potential benefits from MDMA-assisted therapy.
Either that, or the treatments that have 30% success rate are good enough. Like, that's as much attention as we need, right? Or again, context is key. With the evidence-approved treatments are these SSRIs, which can be helpful in some cases, but leading to all these downstream issues with people and all this other, like, if you don't have any of the context of what's actually going on and you're not going to the actual patient, then how can you actually deliver a statement of cost benefit?
Right. And the SSRIs, for PTSD work, as you said, about 30% of the time, which means that 70% of people who are diagnosed with this disorder are not actually entering remission from use of SSRI medication. So that leaves 70% of people who are diagnosed still suffering and symptomatic, often heavily symptomatic from the illness. I would argue as a treating psychiatrist in this space that the treatments that we have, which are the last two treatments that the FDA, medication-based treatments the FDA approved, are Paxil and Zoloft. And those are the ones that we're seeing have only a 30% success rate. And that's the best we got right now. And that's what we've had for the last 20 years. So I think from our standpoint, it's about time there was something new. But the challenging piece of everything that we're talking about also, from my perspective, is that the FDA, that is committee that's voting on MDMA-assisted therapy over the next couple months, is taking the advisory committee's opinions under consideration. And from my understanding, it's under pretty heavy consideration, like to the tune of 67% of the time they follow what the committee says or suggests. So based on the fact that MDMA-assisted therapy, at least also, from a clinical perspective, is in large part disproportionately able to serve the veteran community in particular, that is, really underserved right now in the mental health space. And, in the FDA is more likely, is 67% of the time follows the committee's suggestion. The veteran community must be devastated. Like, what is the impact on the community and the people you work with who have been involved in or, looking forward to hope in this area?
Yeah, there's a quote that I guess I keep using in California because it keeps being a repeated record there, where we've tried for the last 4 or 5 years to pass even the most basic access bill in California. And just the last effort, again, failed. And that was just completely for kind of really silly political reasons, nothing to do with the bill itself. But we've tried every single which way. We even had Republicans sign on, Republicans sponsoring the bill. We got all the way to the governor's desk just to get vetoed, all sorts of different iterations. And I keep getting asked the same question, where it's the veterans that are demanding this, of like some sort of access to an effective treatment. And if you're not going to give us this, give us something, don't just say no, see you later. Give us something. Don't say I support the troops and then say no. And so I say the thing I keep saying is we're definitely disappointed by it, but we're not surprised. And the same thing with this is, if it doesn't go through, it's just another check on what we've come to be used to as veterans in this country, unfortunately. And even just, we were in DC last week, but it's this repeated pattern. If you kind of look at that, where there's this unspoken promise that, or expectation that most people, I think of, like, oh, you're a veteran, you served, thank you for your service. The government's going to take care of you if you're ailing in some sort of way, or there's so much money going to the VA, the hospitals, the military. They must be at the forefront of innovation. And in some cases they actually are. A lot of that comes from the military and research. But time and time again, it requires veterans who are suffering, or the family members of veterans who died after decades, to make it all the way to where they get a voice, to where they go to Congress, to where they finally get somebody to pay attention. And this is like 20 years in the making before anything changes. And it's a repeated story where it was veterans groups that had to come together first before PTSD was even a DSM-5 classification or accepted, that they could get benefits for. It was veterans and families that had to advocate for Agent Orange, for Gulf War syndrome. Most recently, it was a group of veterans that I know that had to go, and it was, again, one of those things where Jon Stewart had to be there and testify in front of Congress just to get veterans basic benefits because of all the chemical fumes they inhaled, because in Afghanistan and other places they're just burning jet fuel, human waste, plastics, and veteran or military were inhaling it. And for the years leading or following that, veterans would go to the VA and say, hey, I'm having rare cancers. I'm 23 and I have pituitary cancer. I'm having major respiratory issues. And the VA would say, oh, that doesn't seem service related. And so it took these people suffering, dying after decades to go to DC themselves and finally get the PACT Act. And so that's just this tragedy. And now with this case, it's taking veterans in the thousands going to other countries to get life-saving care. And so for our perspective, MDMA is just like the bare minimum of like, just pay attention, guys. Like, look at this. Like, this is as silver platter as you can get. Like, what's the problem here, right? You say you want to help, and this is not even us. This is a monumental effort by many other people that it's not even better in focus, but obviously that's where I'm coming from. And so, yeah, it's unfortunate. If it doesn't go through, it's just going to be another thing there, but we won't stop fighting. We won't stop advocating. We've been doing psychedelic work legally in Oregon because of the laws that passed there. And so we're just going to continue doing that with psilocybin in Oregon and Colorado or overseas if we have to. You know, we'll find a way forward. It's just we come to expect at some point the government will make it a little bit easier for us to save our own lives. But until then, we'll keep having to just have these conversations.
You're listening to the Psychedelic Report.
You know, your efforts are really commendable on it. It is to support the community that you're in. And it's a very, very challenging situation that the entire community is in around this, you know, discrepancy that you called out earlier, which is that the results from the published trials seem to be saying this treatment is extremely effective in a scientific and medical context. And yet the committee that provided their recommendations to the FDA, in most of their decisions, were focused on things that were unrelated to the actual results from the trial and how much better people got. And that was really surprising to all of us, at least from the perspective of all of us clinicians and researchers, because again, we focus on the outcomes, and then, you know, the risks that come up in the trials, you know, are interpreted with respect to the outcomes. And then we understand, you know, how much each one impacts each other and how to risk mitigate when this goes to the clinical world, so that anybody can access it and with as much safety as possible. Which is absolutely doable. But I think what this discrepancy in decision making is important to talk about, because people like Congressman Dan Crenshaw called it out, you know, in the similar way that you did, and the confusion around how is it possible that the advisory committee could have been so, from what we could tell, out of context and off base in terms of their recommendation. And then Dan Crenshaw points out that there is a possible, and also this is public now because they released it to the internet for anyone to see, but there were letters written to the FDA committee that appear to have influenced their decision from groups that were very critical of MAPS and the research, and from what I can tell, veterans as well. Can you talk a little bit about that and what's going on there?
Yeah, and so I think it's an important thing, just because it's, again, there's a lot of unknowns, and, you know, I don't want to jump straight to conspiracy theories and having all the pins on the wall and all this kind of stuff, but
yeah, just what we know. Just what we know.
Yeah, exactly. And you want to see what's going on behind the scenes, because it's often a little bit more complicated than what might appear. And as long as I've been in this space for about 7 or so years, there always has been this great support for MAPS and Doblin and all this other kind of stuff, but there's always been this contingent that just hated his guts and hated MAPS, or MAPS started to become too capitalist for them, or started, whatever the reason. There's always been a group that just hates what they stand for or whatever, and that exacerbated even more so when they had the public benefit, which then became Lycos, right? Because then that's the epitome of, you know, capitalism. And there's arguments, there's discussions, there's criticisms to be made there. But the reason I'm establishing is there are people that have this dogmatic just opposition, that it doesn't matter what that group does, it's going to be bad, right? And then when you get into that sort of dynamic, then it becomes less about the actual science, it becomes more about winning. Becomes this sort of tribalism dynamic, and that's kind of my interpretation of what's been going on. I've seen this, and there's organizations like Symposia, which seems small, but they've always been self-proclaimed watchdogs. And I will admit, you know, there are stuff they brought to light that I think is important. I think those groups can be very important, because there's some stuff, especially in the hype around MAPS, MDMA, that can get, you know, swept under the rug or what have you. So there is absolutely the importance there. But also sometimes people get caught up into their own policing or savior sort of dynamic and lose sight of it, or their own political dynamics become shading their actual perspective of what's actually better for the broader humanity in this case, or how do you actually get to a better result. And so sometimes I see with these organizations is that they're very good at tearing down, but not very good at providing solutions, right? It's almost like the movie critic or the food critic. Like, it's a lot easier to say this is shit and much harder to create that dish. There's still the need for those critics, but there's that balance, right? Of it's always easy to tear down what's built. And so if you go to the websites of like Symposia, there are these articles there's a few things again, but some of them, have linked veterans or are making the link of veterans and white supremacists and imperialists. And there's like a podcast that does highlight some of the sexual abuses that have happened around the MDMA trials, but also, within it, it's self-proclaimed of sort of anti-capitalist or anarchist kind of philosophy, which is fine for people that believe in that. But also, I think we should have a level playing field of, like, is that driving your hatred towards this or your positions? Like, if we're not having an honest conversation, I'm pretty frank. I'm going to be out there and advocate for what I think are effective treatments for veterans. And so I'm going to advocate for MDMA. I'm going to advocate for psilocybin. I'm going to advocate for ayahuasca, if it's through the system or if it's in the jungles. Like, I'm just trying to get veterans more tools. I have no political agenda in there. But if there's other groups that are just anti this, I think that also should be brought up there. So there definitely is a anti US or imperialistic dynamic, which gets lumped into veterans. Generally speaking, the space is very supportive of veterans. I've spoken at many conferences and engagements, and I always get great response from the audience. I get honest questions. Like, I appreciate the questions where people might not necessarily agree with the military or whatever, but they have a very heartfelt question of where they are, and we can meet in that, right? Like, we don't have to agree, but we can meet in common respect and that. I've also gotten the peppering of questions that are essentially like, do you feel like these people who I view as murderers deserve to get treatment? That comes in every once in a while. Or do you feel like these veterans that are inherently bad deserve to heal? And so, you have to answer those tactfully, but it does come up. And so there is that dynamic in the space. But like I said, across the board, more often than not, it is very supportive and a great dynamic. And I also don't come back at that same sort of energy, because I don't think we should be making that judgment of who deserves to heal or not, because that starts getting into very dangerous territory. Anyway, so that being said, there is these groups, like you said, there has been revealed that they flooded the FDA and the advisors with letters. They put together this petition. There's been many years of this podcast. They've been able to have presence in terms of the commentary, as well as being advisors in the committee itself, right? And there's members of these groups that actually immediately after the advisory committee came out said, hey, this is how I did this. This is how I tanked the MDMA trials, like took credit for it. So we called it out, and then immediately we got attacked for essentially quoting these people. So they immediately played victim that we were quoting them, and that meant we're targeting them, even though they were taking credit for exactly doing this. And so it's still kind of in that. And so I'm just trying to play sensitive of like, okay, I'll call out general sort of thing. And so not going to name anybody, just because even though they continue to put themselves front and center of this sort of thing, there's also that sort of victim mentality. And I don't really care. I don't care about that group. I don't care about Lycos. I care about veterans getting this treatment. And so that's what we're kind of advocate. And again, I don't want people to like bombard any group or this, everybody's entitled to their opinion, but people should know about what's going on. But the way to respond to it is not reach them out or not direct emails or anything directly to any person, no internet bullying or anything like that. The way people should respond is we have like our own essential like survey petition that people can sign up for, that we can help activate them on very short notice. We had over 40 veterans in DC that came on a moment's notice to help us out. Many other therapists, researchers that have been supporting this on very short notice. So that's a way, like common group or the common voice that we can get together is the way we can approach this. Like those other organizations will work themselves out. They'll have to come to terms with whatever their stance is. But again, like I said, it's a tearing down mentality because there are absolute victims, and that I want to be absolutely clear. There have been people who have been abused by therapists. From everything I read, it was appropriately reported by MAPS, and they went through the exact protocols. And I don't think it's indicative of the MDMA treatment itself. I think it's just what happens in these vulnerable states with MDMA or without it. Again, why we have malpractice
Right.
insurance and
It happens in all areas of medicine.
Yeah, and everything I hear, it's just like, I don't want this to happen, but not providing, because they're coming at it of the savior to future people getting abused, but at the limit of millions of people who could get potential benefit. And they're not providing any sort of tract of improving this, because they also say, okay, well, let's give it more time that these things are resolved. As long as MDMA is Schedule 1, and if the FDA declares, even in this initial, that they don't see enough evidence, that's devastating for this. And you can't make the improvements on MDMA as long as it's Schedule 1, because it's so hard, it's so expensive. If you have the FDA even slightly admit that there is some sort of medical benefit, then you start getting the rescheduling, and then that's when you are able to improve all this kind of stuff. So it's almost like they're shooting themselves in the foot, which again gets me into this sort of like, is there a complex mode of like, this is their importance and what have you, because it's just overall like not helping anybody, even the people they claim to help, in my humble opinion on that. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of the situation of like, we want to just bring this out that there is other stuff going on behind the scenes. Like, this didn't happen in isolation, and that's part of the reason that people are so shocked. And again, I'm not putting it all on them. Like I said, there's room for improvement on MAPS as well. But I do think the science is there. And I do think, like, if we're trying to help the greater people, even those victims, we need to get this out of the shadows. We need to get it into a system that can help have better like assessments and regulations. And if certain groups are just against it because it's associated with Dublin or associated with MAPS or associated with Lycos, that's not a good reason to deny millions of people these sort of treatments. And again, replace any of those names. I don't care who's in charge of it. It's at the end of the day,
this is not personal.
Is this going to help more people or not? That's the easiest solution. And if it is, then you kind of have to justify your opinion of why you're so far against it and going to such efforts. And then, going on TED Talks bragging about how you derailed this treatment to millions of people. It's just, and, we've both seen in the space that there's amazing people that just sacrifice their lives for the sake of others. There's other people that get caught up in the glimmer and glow and celebrity status of it. It's the psychedelic space is probably more inclined to have sort of that enhancement of ego in a lot of ways, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two things that I want to bring up here that are really, or maybe three, but to come back to, which is number one, I guess I can understand drawing the line between an anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist mentality and veterans, because veterans are part of that system. However, extending that to, as you said, determining who has a right to heal and who doesn't is a very, very serious slippery slope, and it violates one of the core rules of Hippocratic medicine, Hippocrates being the founder of Western medicine, which is that everyone deserves the right to heal. And we even have a question we ask everyone when we're interviewing them for medical school, that at least many of us do, that is, if somebody, name X person that you absolutely despise, comes into the ER when you're the attending and they have a mortal wound and you have to take care of them, what do you do? And if they say they don't take care of them, or they won't take care of them, they don't deserve to heal, they don't get into medical school.
No.
Everyone deserves the right to heal. If that person's a criminal, then charges will be pressed and they can get processed in the criminal court thereafter for whatever they did, right? But they deserve the right to heal. And, I think we can't forget, amidst all the other things that we're talking about here, around people having particular anti-capitalist sentiments or anti-imperialist sentiments, which many of us probably share in large part, right? That about how things could be better. We can't forget that we can't fall down the slippery slope of allowing that to think that we have the ability to determine who and decide who has the right to healing and who doesn't. Right. And I think that is one of the critical takeaways that I want to make sure everybody understands here. And then, the second piece is that somebody was actually taking pride and publicly bragging about disrupting the moving forward of this treatment to be available to veterans and other people with suffering from PTSD, the millions and tens of millions of people, that somebody was actually bragging about disrupting that. I don't understand the mentality. I'm a psychiatrist, and I have trouble understanding the mentality of what is motivating a person to be so outwardly bragging about something that is disruptive to so many people's lives and to the potential healing of, millions of people. I can't say that I can right now understand the mentality of a person like that, but this happened, you said, right? And this happened in a TED environment?
Yeah, there was like a TED talk after the fact of the thing, and then Twitter battles and all sorts of social media. I think it's kind of cut back a little bit since we called it out. But yeah, the reason we called it out is not to focus on anybody, but if somebody puts himself in the public forum of I did this or we did this, I feel like people should know about that. It'd be the same sort of thing. And I think, we're both logical people. If somebody we knew and respected that would just like hands down pointed out A plus B of like, hey, this is not, the science is not there and this is dangerous to people, I would, be like, oh, I was wrong. I don't think maybe this is not the right time for it. I have not seen that person.
We haven't seen that. That hasn't come out yet.
Yeah.
You're listening to the Psychedelic Report.
Looking at the equation type of framework here, we have on one hand, the FDA provides clearance for MDMA-assisted therapy for veterans with PTSD in August or what have you. And then, we start to gradually unroll clinical programming that starts to offer these people treatment who are currently 70% are not responsive to the best standard treatment we have. And with all of the challenges and the incredibly high suicide rate and all of these challenges that we are trying to address, we have on one hand MDMA-assisted therapy that can assist with that and needs some more risk mitigation likely. And then on the other side, we have somebody who is bragging about disrupting, moving that forward. From your perspective, and this can be completely speculation. If that's great. But what is it that somebody like that stands to benefit? Who stands to benefit, and what is the benefit that you think is coming from the disruption of moving this treatment forward? Because it seems to be something that is so widely beneficial and then will trickle down once MDMA is rescheduled. All of this will trickle down into full legalization because it will be a medicine. So it has to be illegal if it's going to be, like a Schedule II medicine. The Schedule I DEA position is a lot of what prevents medicine from becoming legal, as you alluded to earlier. So again, can you help me understand what is to be gained from the disruption of this work?
Yeah, I mean, I have to give everybody the benefit of the doubt on this side of I don't think there's evil intention, or I don't think there's some big money-making thing on either side. I do think wherever it's coming from, it is coming from people that are thinking that they're helping in the same way that I am thinking of what I'm doing is helping veterans. And, there could be things that we see that all the time in politics where you're so dogged on something and then the facts come out and then you're like, oh, that was not the case. So I have to give the benefit of the doubt. I do think in their hearts of hearts that they think that this coming through is going to open up Pandora's box in terms of patient abuse and all this kind of stuff. They've called MAPS both big pharma and a cult in the same sort of breath. Right. So I do have to think that they just think that MAPS is going to unleash something bad in terms of this is a slippery slope in terms of that. I vehemently disagree, but I have to give them that belief of that's where they're coming from, and they are thinking that it's going to be more harmful, and so that's why they're so dogged about this, right? And so I don't want to cast anybody out for that. I feel like it's just the wrong track, and I feel like there's many more ways to actually help those people by having a more progressive conversation moving forward of how do we make this better and how do we get it through? How do we add more tools? How do we make this better? And I'm hoping that one, the FDA does follow science and says yes. And then two, these people that are so dogged about derailing it right now, maybe they'll come to the table and help create a better system. I mean, there's too much division right now in general. And I think that this seems to mirror everything else that's going on, is just people get so invested in their own camp that they can't even see the logic outside of that after a certain time. You build so much into creating this reality, and that's what we're at in just the general ecosystem, where people just live in very different worlds and they have their own supporting things. And then you get into this feedback loop. And, I can't say I'm not beyond that, but I try to do as many reality checks as possible that I feel pretty good where we're at. So, I want to give it all grace. I don't want to, again, be angry or mean or anything like that. I do want to point out that is happening, because then that allows us to counter those narratives, which I just think are blatantly untrue. And again, there's going to be people that have their political beliefs and are counter to the compasses and counter to maps. And like you said, there's going to be a whole array of different beliefs. And even us, we're trying to build a community system in Oregon that allows veterans to access these treatments outside of insurance and outside of the VA in an affordable way. So, I'm not trying to just build into this machine, but there's many different ways that they can approach it. The only way to resolve the 100,000 veteran problem is through government funding through the VA system. So there's many ways to approach an issue, right? So it's not all black and white with this. So,
I was just going to try to, sum this up a little bit for people. I think what needs to be understood here is what's happening and what's been publicly admitted, and the impact of those actions that people we now know have proudly, publicly, and deliberately taken, right? This wasn't like we did this because we were trying to, who knows what. It wasn't like they felt bad about it. This was like a proud public admission of taking down the MDMA trials, regardless of the negative impact that has. And then we have the FDA advisory committee, pharmacologic advisory committee, that, the FDA committee follows their recommendations, which are supposed to be objective 67% of the time, right? And then we know now that the opinions of those committee members were heavily influenced by a very much non-objective group. And so while I admire your humility and generosity in the way that you're describing the situation, I think the bigger problem that I want to bring to the surface is this is a bit outrageous, right? Like, we have what is supposed to be an extraordinarily objective committee that was influenced and directly influenced by folks who are admitting to having influenced them.
Yeah.
Right. And so there should be no confusion that there were ulterior motives behind the letters that were written and then publicly disclosed later to the FDA committee that influenced the way they looked at the research and why they likely didn't pay much attention to the actual findings. Instead, they paid attention to, is it possible that we can figure out a way that we can justify these findings as not interpretable due to all of these issues that were brought to our attention in advance, right? Yeah. So it steered the direction of the way they were looking at it and biased them. And we see that in the response. And now it's publicly admitted. So, we have a couple months left before the FDA ends up ultimately making this decision about clearance or about next steps, if not clearance. And what can we do if this is the state of affairs, and simple letters like this can be motivating to steer a objective FDA committee? What can we do as our community, as the veterans community, the community of many folks who listen to this show, can we write people? Can we share our opinions? How do we, get involved in any possible way to help explain that this actually is real medicine, it's actually working, and that we need, we're on board with moving it forward?
Yeah, absolutely. And then first I want to say too, this was the lost train of thought that I had earlier. Come across like a few different organizations for different things. And there's, especially in like policy and statewide, And there's some that devolve into just kind of bomb throwers, or like I said, like tearing down. And after we called this out and brought it to people's attention, people out of the woodwork, like by the dozens, came to us and just either texted me or sent me an email like, thanks for exposing this. It's about time somebody called them out. And this is researchers, esteemed like people in the space that everybody know. And because what happens is a lot of these people are like researchers or academics, and they don't want to get caught in the drama. And so if somebody throws a bomb at them or somebody like calls them out, they just kind of ignore it, because then they don't get caught in the muck where these people, and they can be diligent, where I know people who almost destroy their reputation because they push back, and then they just get berated, or they get all these articles that are not substantiated, and they just keep getting this, and then it just brings doubt about it. And so these bomb throwers thrive, and that's in a broader sort of thing of this minority that's more active, oftentimes can have a huge voice in these things, because they say the same thing with sort of the abortion dynamic or their NRA. They're not they're indicative of the bigger population, but they are the most active smaller voices. Not comparing those two groups, but it is like small groups can have tremendous impact if they are just dogged in terms of how they go about it. And so there's so many of these people that are just like, about time, like they said this, there's never been repercussions. And so that's why when people say like, how can the small organization have that effect? That's how, just because most people just want to do their job. Most people just want to be researchers and don't want to get caught up in the drama. And that's understandable, right? Because otherwise then we're getting caught in like Twitter wars. I don't give a shit about Twitter. I don't want to be responding or like having tit for tat with any of this kind of stuff,
Yeah, we're saving lives working with people, right?
Yeah,
That's
better things to do, exactly. But yeah, we have like a survey on our Instagram website. You can sign up for that. That's just for when we activate people in DC, or if we need a kind of more joint coalition. Other than that, just like share of like, hey, this is important, and it's less than a month. It's August 11th. Share with people. Talk to your representative. We're not trying to pressure the FDA. We're trying to make sure that there's enough political voice, there's enough person voice, that this is a controversial decision, that they know that they have public support and back. And we're not trying to like beat them into like this. And I don't think we even have that power and wouldn't want to use that anyway. It's more about like, hey, this is our right. We want this to happen. This is what we all deserve, veteran or others alike. So just talk to other people, share other messages, talk to your representative like, hey, do you know this very important decision is coming up August 11th, and this could be a game changer for many veterans. And then sign up for our survey. And there's going to be more, very short period of time, but there's going to be more ways to activate. And even worst case scenario, there's a lot more we can do afterwards, right? And so it's about us joining our voice and demanding what's owed to us.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. And it's at Heroic Hearts, right?
Yeah.
We'll have that linked in the show notes. And I think it's also important to note that it's fairly unprecedented that, from at least my memory of the history of medicine, that there are people or groups of people disrupting the movement of a treatment forward through the FDA for the ability to provide it to the patients. Historically speaking, I think it's typically only been the other way around, where it's groups of patients demanding treatment. I have not seen, from what I recall, maybe you have memory of this, but where, there's been protests about moving a treatment forward. And, this is really, from what I know, unprecedented in the history of medicine, and needs to be looked at very critically.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's wild. I mean, everybody has their stake in the game. It's the psychedelic space is weird, and people have made their claims. And even within that industry, some people don't want, they want to keep what they have, or if they view somebody else as the other, again, it's not outside of tribalism itself.
For sure. And I think there's a way to meet in the middle, right? Like, if we're going to end this on a positive note, many of us likely share the same fundamental beliefs, and, moving MDMA forward through the FDA-based legalization path, which will help veterans, but it will also help everyone, is actually the best, fastest path to making MDMA-assisted therapy more accessible to everyone who is in need of it. And also the legalization, it accelerates the legalization path rather than just having to focus on decriminalization, which prevents licensed providers from providing the medicine. With legalization, people like me and highly trained therapists can provide legal psychedelic medicine other than ketamine. And that's just so exciting for patients around the country who are in need of these treatments that currently can't access them in legal, medical office environments. So, I really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. Thank you for your insight into what's going on. That was really, really helpful and thoughtful. And I look forward to chatting with you again soon.
Dave, always good. Looking forward to seeing you in person.
Thanks for listening to The Psychedelic Report. Visit us at thepsychedelicreport.com. This show is recorded weekly on Clubhouse with a live audience. The Psychedelic Report was brought to you by Apollo Neuroscience and produced by Future Medicine Media. While I am a doctor, I'm not your doctor. So please don't take anything you hear on the Psychedelic Report as personal medical advice because we don't know you. If you have questions about anything you hear on this show, please consult with your doctor.